Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share real history and bring important stories like this to more people. The Potsdam Conference. The moment the post-war world was decided. In the summer of 1945, the world stood on the edge of a new era. The most devastating conflict in human history, World War II, was drawing to a close in Europe. Cities lay in ruins, millions had perished, and entire nations had collapsed under the weight of war. Yet victory did not bring immediate peace. Instead, the leaders of the victorious Allied powers gathered in a quiet suburb outside Berlin to decide what the future of the world would look like. This meeting would become known as the Potsdam Conference, and its decisions would shape the political landscape of the 20th century. A world after war. By May 1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered. The regime of Adolf Hitler had collapsed after years of brutal warfare and genocide. Berlin was occupied by Soviet troops, and the once powerful German state had ceased to exist as a functioning government. But the war against Japan still continued in the Pacific. The Allied powers, primarily the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, had to answer enormous questions. What should be done with Germany? How could Europe be rebuilt? And perhaps most importantly, how could another world war be prevented? These questions brought the leaders of the Allied nations together in July 1945 in the city of Potsdam, located just outside Berlin. The leaders arrive. Three powerful men represented the Allied powers. From the United States came President Harry S. Truman. Truman had only recently taken office after the sudden death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt in April 1945. Unlike Roosevelt, Truman had little experience dealing with the complex alliances of wartime diplomacy. From the Soviet Union came the powerful and secretive leader Joseph Stalin. Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union for decades and had led his nation through the brutal struggle against Nazi Germany. Representing Britain was Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the charismatic wartime leader who had inspired Britain to resist Nazi domination. However, partway through the conference, British elections produced a surprise result. Churchill lost power and was replaced by the new Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Thus, the conference witnessed an unusual moment in history, one leader being replaced during negotiations that would shape the future of the world. The setting in Potsdam. The conference was held at Cecilienhof Palace, a large manor located in Potsdam. The palace had once been used by the German royal family, but now it served as the meeting place for the leaders of the Allied world. Around the palace, soldiers from different nations stood guard. Berlin itself was a shattered city. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed by bombing and artillery. The streets were filled with rubble, burned buildings, and the remains of what had once been one of Europe's greatest capitals. This devastation served as a constant reminder of what had been at stake in the war. The question of Germany. One of the most important topics discussed at the conference was the future of Germany. The Allies agreed that Germany must never again become a military threat. To achieve this, they proposed several major policies. Demilitarization. Germany's military would be dismantled completely. Denazification, Nazi ideology and influence, would be removed from German society. Democratization, Germany would eventually be transformed into a democratic state. Decentralization, power would be distributed among regional governments rather than concentrated in a strong central authority. The Allies also decided that Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones. Each zone would be controlled by one of the victorious powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France. Even Berlin, located deep within the Soviet-controlled zone, would be divided into 4 sectors. At the time, this arrangement was meant to be temporary, but in reality, it would eventually lead to the permanent division of Germany during the Cold War. Reparations and economic questions. Another major issue discussed at Potsdam was reparations. The Soviet Union had suffered enormous devastation during the war. Millions of Soviet citizens had died, and vast areas of the country had been destroyed. Stalin demanded large reparations from Germany. The Western Allies agreed that Germany should pay compensation, but they worried that excessive demands could destroy the German economy completely. They remembered the mistakes made after World War I, when heavy reparations had contributed to economic collapse and political extremism in Germany. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Each occupying power would take reparations mainly from its own zone of occupation. However, the Soviet Union would also receive additional industrial equipment from the Western zones. This agreement temporarily satisfied all sides, but tensions remained. The fate of Eastern Europe. Perhaps the most difficult discussions concerned the future of Eastern Europe. During the final stages of the war, Soviet forces had liberated or occupied much of Eastern Europe, including Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Stalin wanted to ensure that these countries would have governments friendly to the Soviet Union. Truman and Churchill were concerned that Soviet influence might lead to the spread of communism across Europe. One particularly sensitive issue was the border of Poland. The Soviet Union insisted that Poland's eastern border should move westward, allowing the USSR to keep territory it had taken earlier in the war. To compensate Poland, Germany would lose large territories in the west, including lands east of the Oder and Neisse rivers. This decision resulted in the mass migration of millions of Germans, who were forced to leave these regions. It became one of the largest population movements in European history. The Potsdam Declaration. While the conference focused primarily on Europe, the war against Japan was still ongoing. During the meeting, the United States, Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender. The declaration warned that failure to surrender would result in prompt and utter destruction. At that moment, very few people understood the full meaning of those words. Just days earlier, Truman had received secret news that the United States had successfully tested a new and terrifying weapon: the atomic bomb. The atomic secret. During the conference, Truman briefly informed Stalin that the United States possessed a powerful new weapon. Truman expected Stalin to be surprised. However, Stalin reacted calmly. Unknown to Truman, Soviet intelligence had already obtained information about the American atomic program. This quiet moment in Potsdam symbolized the beginning of a new rivalry. Soon, the wartime alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union would dissolve into mistrust and competition. Growing tensions. Although the conference ended with several agreements, deep disagreements remained between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. Each side had different visions for the future. The United States and Britain hoped to rebuild Europe through democracy and economic cooperation. The Soviet Union, after suffering immense destruction, wanted security and friendly governments along its borders. These conflicting goals slowly hardened into political rivalry. Within a few years, Europe would be divided by what Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. The division of Germany. The decisions made at Potsdam laid the groundwork for the division of Germany into two separate states. In the Western zones, the United States, Britain, and France eventually supported the creation of a democratic nation called West Germany. In the Eastern zone, the Soviet Union established a socialist state known as East Germany. Berlin itself became a focal point of Cold War tensions, eventually leading to the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. What had begun as a temporary occupation became a decades-long division of Europe. The human consequences. Behind the political negotiations were the lives of millions of ordinary people. Families were displaced. Cities had to be rebuilt from ruins. Survivors of the Holocaust struggled to rebuild their lives after the atrocities committed under the Nazi regime. The decisions made at Potsdam affected borders, governments, and economies, but they also shaped the everyday reality of people across Europe. The beginning of a new world. Historians often view the Potsdam Conference as the moment when the alliance of World War II began transforming into the rivalry of the Cold War. Within just a few years, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union would grow into a global ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. The world that emerged from the ruins of World War II would be defined by nuclear weapons, military alliances, and political competition between superpowers. Legacy of the conference. Today, the Potsdam Conference remains one of the most significant diplomatic meetings in modern history. Its decisions shaped the division of Germany, the borders of Eastern Europe, the balance of power after World War II, the early structure of the Cold War. Though the leaders at Potsdam hoped to build a stable peace, they could not fully control the forces that were already shaping the world. Conclusion. In July and August 1945, inside the quiet palace at Potsdam, three powerful nations attempted to design the future. They negotiated borders, economies, and political systems. But beneath the agreements lay growing mistrust. The war had ended, but a new global struggle was beginning. The Potsdam Conference was not only the final chapter of World War II diplomacy. It was also the first chapter of the Cold War. And the decisions made during those summer weeks would influence international politics for generations to come.